and welcome to This Week in the News, brought to you by the editors of peoplesworld.org. Hope everybody had a nice weekend and you're ready to ripping and ready to start this week. With us this morning is Sue Webb from New Haven. Good morning, Sue.
Good morning.
And John Wojcik from Chicago. Hi, John. How's the weather out there?
Joe, good morning. Yes, it's untypical for Chicago. Nice and warm.
Nice and warm. Well, I'm coming to you this morning from Youngstown, Ohio. Just had Mom's birthday party yesterday. She was 94.
Wow.
And it is humid as all get out here, but that's okay. At least it's not freezing. Let's get started. Wojcik, there's a big debate in Congress, in the House of Representatives now over the Trans-Pacific Partnership and Fast Track. Where does it stand now? Does the opposition to giving President Obama Fast Track authority, is it large enough to prevent a yes vote in the House? Do you have a sense of it?
Well, it is large enough to prevent a yes vote if people vote A, the way they want to vote, and B, the way majorities of their constituencies want them to vote. But with the wheeling and dealing, that makes predictions much less possible. But there is enough there, and the opposition. This is really one of the biggest and most successful campaigns so far by the labor movement, because it has focused so much attention, all the branches of government, the news, public discussions. This has become a major campaign. Presidential candidates have weighed in. So I think there's an increased consciousness now how trade is used, along with so many other things, against the interest of the vast majority in the country.
Now, speaking of the vast majority, Sue, you said, we talked about this a couple times before, and you said a few weeks ago that you didn't think trade was a big issue amongst people in this country. Has the debate around fast tracking, it's kind of class struggle in the raw. Has that changed your mind a little bit about that estimate?
Well, it's a big issue, for sure. But whether it's something that most people know about or pay attention to or understand, I don't know. I haven't looked at polls. I guess it would. I don't know if there is a poll on this. I don't know if others of you are familiar with any polls on it, but my guess is that a lot of people don't understand it, and it's not. They don't see its connection to their day-to-day life. It's a little bit complicated. It's not an obvious issue. It's not a direct. There's not a direct connection. So I think I'm guessing that it's not the top on people's working class people. If they happen to be in a union where they're getting information about it, then I think it's much higher. If you did a poll and you compared union members and non-union members, I'm sure there's a big difference.
But when jobs are exported overseas, people feel
Right.
that pretty acutely.
People know that. Yes, they do. Those who've been affected by it, whether they're in a union or not, they understand something about that, but I think a lot of people don't.
And isn't that why Wojcik of Labor is saying, trade unions are saying to the Democrats and Republicans and anybody else, if you support this legislation, you can forget about it. We are going to defeat you. We're going to work against you in this election, next election, and you're going to pay a price. Is that the right thing to do?
Well, frankly, I have no problem with that, because unions have a history of supporting candidates. Years ago, it used to be put the money into a campaign, the candidates used the union money to get themselves elected, and then they turned around and did little or nothing for the labor movement. And we saw 10 years ago that started to change. The labor movement began to assert itself more and more. And if they're going to fork across money and support for candidates, because under the current election rules, people get elected, you need money to run campaigns.
But wait a minute now. You guys published an article last week that said, and it, raised an important point. It said, look, I understand that this is a problem, fast track TPP. I understand jobs are going to be lost, but there are bigger issues at stake here. And the biggest issue is that, you got to defeat the extreme right. And if you say that, you're going to go after President Obama and you're going to go after Democrats who you're sawing the legs off of the chair that you're going to need to sit in come next election. And God damn it, it's either going to be a Democrat or a Republican sitting in that chair. So come on. What are you talking about? Sue?
Well, actually, the article that you're referring to cites an article in The Hill, the newspaper that, or the publication that reports on developments in Congress, in which AFL-CIO President Rich Trumka, actually it's citing that article citing a USA Today interview with Trumka, in which he said that it wasn't inevitable that the AFL-CIO will endorse whoever wins the Democratic nomination, in particular Hillary Clinton, if they come out in support of the TPP. It didn't say they were going to work against. He didn't say they were going to work against them, and he said, if we're convinced that neither candidate were interested in raising wages, then we'd probably spend our money elsewhere, probably on Senate candidates and congressional candidates and governors and state houses and things of that sort, where we'd have a much greater effect. So he mentioned two issues, and one is the TPP. He didn't say, just to be accurate, that they were going to work against a Democrat or anybody else. The article raised the issue, and I think it's a valid one to raise, is because there's been some experience with it. At least my interpretation is that, would the labor movement be backing itself into a corner by making such statements? He said, the author of the article, John Kay, said that he's opposed to making the issue a litmus test for Democratic candidates, and he says Hillary needs to measure up to the challenge, and we must help her. And he cites Bernie, like Bernie Sanders is doing. And the reality is that defeating the right in 2016 will require a tremendous exertion that must include the Clintons and President Obama. So I think what he's saying is that you're not going to agree on everything, but the overriding issue is to defeat the ultra-right. On the other hand, I agree with Wojcik that, and with Rich Trumka, that the labor movement does have to assert itself, and on behalf of the working class as a whole, because even if their number of union members has shrunk, I think the labor movement speaks for the working class as a whole. I think it's a matter of emphasis.
Two things. Number one, first of all, we're talking about the primaries, and what they've said is that if a Democrat in the primaries supports TTP, we're going to look elsewhere and find us a candidate who has a better position. And that has had a big impact. I've read several articles where people who are running for Congress are like, whoa, wait a minute, these guys are saying that if I support this thing, I'm finished. They're not going to support me. And then President Obama says, well, don't worry about that because I'll come and campaign for you. And they're like, well, that's really nice, but you're a lame duck guy, and I'm not sure that support is going to do much good, So, isn't Obama, Wojcik, isn't he like hurting the Democrats' chance to win the presidential election by going so far, out on a limb on this TTP thing?
Well, frankly, it could hurt. I don't think it's going to be the thing that will destroy the Democrats' chances, but it could hurt. And it reflects his going out on the limb that way reflects very real differences, because there are some people who believe we need the trade, and then we can fix the problems the labor movement is pointing out is that so far, even where there have been agreements to fix the problems, that is to bolster the rights of workers, prevent the exploitation of jobs, those kinds of things built in, even in those cases, it hasn't worked. And look at Colombia as the best example. All kinds of safeguards there, and since the safeguards have been put in place, 1,000 trade union leaders and organizers have been killed. And when we connect the dots on this, this is very much connected to defeating the ultra-right, because, internationally, extreme right-wing governments that are very, very repressive are part of the mix here and are operating here. And these trade agreements very often favor and encourage the forces that support these right-wing governments around the world. And that connects up with the ultra-right here in the United States, too. They have an interest in having corporate control in Colombia rather than a people's government, similar to what exists in Venezuela, for example. So I think that, it's a big battle. And, Sue is correct. A lot of people don't understand this. And that's one of the problems that we have. Our media, our information distribution system, the internet is used by ruling class forces, and they don't want to debate this. They rather debate other things. So this is correct. A lot of people aren't aware of it, and I think that this fight. One good thing about this fight is that the American people are being introduced to the importance of international trade in the whole
People
thing.
are being introduced to it and are becoming aware of it.
Yeah.
And, if you want my 2 cents, I think that we have a sophisticated, working class in this country. And I think that people have a big picture, outlook, and they understand that everybody ain't got to agree on everything. But I think that the problem will arise if, in fact, the labor movement and the people who are defending working class interests don't take a strong position on it. Then people will say, well, they'll be dismayed and they'll be discouraged. And it takes a fight to win. And the only thing that the ruling people in this country take seriously is power, relations of power, when you push them hard, And so if, labor says, Wojcik, you made this point, if they're not taken seriously, and if they don't throw their weight around, I think that the problem will be that, they'll just, push them over and go about their business. And that's the real danger. So I think that they're taking a good, strong stance, and it's in the interest of the country as a whole, and in the struggle against the extreme right for them to pursue this kind of strategy. Let's move the agenda a little bit. We've been talking about Fast Track for about, 15 minutes. The presidential election is heating up. You got a new Democrat, Lincoln Chafee. Well, sometimes he's a Democrat, and he was an independent and formerly a Republican. Now he's in the race, and you got, maybe a dozen Republicans. So things are starting to heat up a little bit. I noticed that Mrs. Clinton gave an important speech about voting rights, Sue, and she's come out in favor of universal registration. You turn 18, you're automatically registered to vote. Good thing, right?
Yeah, it is. And I was struck this weekend to read a news analysis type art. Well, it was presented as a news article in the New York Times by two reporters, um, basically suggesting that reflecting the views of some what I would call more blue dog type Democrats, that she shouldn't move to the left because she's could endanger, the Democrats' election chances. And I think the article misrepresented some things and misinterpreted some things. Um, but I just want to read one sentence from there. Hang on just a second. Um, as Mrs. Clinton intensifies her campaign for the Democratic nomination, it is clear from her left-leaning policy stances, her hiring, and her focus on data-driven organizing that her strategy is modeled on Mr. Obama's, not her husband's. And what they claim that Bill Clinton's strategy was trying to win the middle, and that Obama model was activating his base. I don't think that's an accurate characterization. But anyway, and then it says, if she won, it would suggest that the so-called Obama coalition of young, non-white, and female voters is transferable to another Democrat, etc. I think this is a little distorted, but and it quotes Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, and Heidi Heitkamp from North Dakota, who are more conservative on a lot of issues. So I think that there is an attempt to push her to a more centrist approach, whereas it's clear that the country as a whole has moved more, I don't want to say to the left, but in a more leftward direction on a range of issues. And the issue of voting rights is huge. And it affects not only African Americans, it affects older voters who are being disenfranchised, it affects students who are being disenfranchised by these restrictive laws, and other categories of people. So anyway, there is a debate up there inside the Beltway and among some more conservative politicos to push
Well,
her.
we're always going to debate that. And, I was always thinking, Mrs. Clinton is not her husband. We shouldn't
Right.
blame her husband's faults on her necessarily. I mean, he's one person and she's another. But how about that Bernie Sanders, Wojcik? He's getting big crowds last week. You got big crowds in Iowa, 1,000 people here, 1,000 people there.
Yeah,
And
well,
Iowa caucuses are a year away.
Joe, that's interesting that you bring that up, but again, that's part of it. You got the labor movement on the one hand doing what it's doing. You have Bernie Sanders putting some of those issues really out front and center. That's all part of the movement. We just finished talking about Hillary Clinton. It's not even just a personal thing that she's not the same as Bill Clinton, but it's a political thing. Hillary Clinton in 2015 is not the same thing as Hillary Clinton either. 10 years ago. She's different from herself in the sense that she's the product of a whole array of political forces that are different now, that are fighting hard on issues, and it's reflected. Some of what she's doing is a reflection of that, what Bernie Sanders, and I was in Iowa when Obama won the first Iowa caucuses, and that shock for me, I remember I was with Pepe Lozano, and I went into a high school auditorium that was filled with all white working class people, and they were on their feet and cheering and pushing for Barack Obama. When he showed up, it was like.
But that's the whole point, People are like tired of the old Democratic machine.
Yeah. So
it's time for a change, and maybe this is what's behind the spurt of support in Iowa for Bernie Sanders. I mean, they want an independent socialist kind of candidate to come out and take a strong position. No?
Yeah, it's a grassroots yearning for something that is different, for something that's positive, and he's speaking to the issues that are important to them
Sue,
in
are we
terms.
underestimating the electorate? I mean, you say that they've moved to the left. I mean, maybe, who knows what's going to happen. And I read an article last week that said that Hillary Clinton's negatives are up, and people are really concerned about that. So I know that there's this aura of inevitability around the campaign. They try to create the image that a person's unstoppable, but maybe that's not the case. Sue, what do you think?
Well, I think it's early in the campaign. What is this, June of 2015, and the elections are a year, little less
Yeah,
than a year
yeah.
and a half
Well,
from now. There are several Democratic candidates that now, as you mentioned, Malley from Maryland, former governor of Maryland, and Lincoln Chafee from Rhode Island, as well as Bernie Sanders. I don't. Am I missing somebody? But there may be more who enter the race, and so we'll see. I think it's good that there are this variety of candidates in the Democratic race because it'll liven up the debate and hopefully raise issues that are of real concern to the majority, the 99%. And like you say, I think people really want to be energized and excited like they were for Obama. I mean, he spoke to real issues that concern people, and he challenged the business as usual kind of please everybody style that people like Bill Clinton did engage in, the triangulation and so on and so forth. So we'll see. I don't know.
Yeah,
See how it goes.
and Joe, too, I would like to add, it's important that that other candidacies and movements emerge because too much we're still hung up on the hero thing. We wait for a hero who's going to come and save the day. What
Mm.
people are seeing now, more than just a hero, is that there's a movement going on. There are forces involved in the movement: labor, immigrant rights, women's organizations, et cetera, and different candidates emerging. And if you look at all those Democratic candidates, even if they're obviously not all going to win the nomination, but it's important to bring forward these more progressive figures because, I mean, look at that Republican lineup where they have 20 candidates who essentially agree on everything, almost everything, and almost everything that they agree on is regressive and backwards. It's a horrible, ugly clown circus, a mean clown circus, that they
But there must be a lot of dissension within the Republican ranks.
yeah,
Lindsey Graham announced last week, and a couple of others are expected. So I don't know what's going on. I guess the Koch brothers must be pretty upset um, um, because they're supporting Scott Walker. So we'll see what happens. In the meantime, in L.A., the city council passed a bill calling for a $15 minimum wage by 2020. Big victory, guys, right? Do you think
oh
it's
yeah.
going to have an impact in other parts of the country?
Yeah, yeah. This is a big step forward, and it's again, it was a hard-won fight, but it was won by a coalition of forces. It's also a testimony to the labor movement's recent decision. By recent, I don't mean last week, but in the recent years, to reach out and work with other movements and other community political organizations, non-traditional labor groups, worker centers, because that thing in Los Angeles was precisely that kind of coalition.
And it takes a coalition to
And
win,
they were
right?
out on the streets. We were there. Peoples were always there covering those big demonstrations in Los Angeles in April, and they did everything: lobbying, demonstrating, uniting all those groups, and it shows how victory is possible.
And now the fight is shifting to New York, where the Governor Cuomo said that he's going to set up a labor board that will make a determination about raising the minimum wage, and so there's a big campaign now to convince that board to do so. I mean, the New York City Mayor de Blasio has come out in favor of it, and now Governor Cuomo. And if you have out on the West Coast, you know, LA doing it, and on the East Coast, New York, we might just see, and it's going to be a big issue, I think, in this campaign.
This is so
Let,
heartening. It's so heartening.
it's very heartening.
Because the Republicans have blocked any attempt to raise the minimum wage, and here the movement said, well, then the hell with you, we're going to raise it ourselves all over the city, all over the country, city by city, town by town. Congress has always been, you know, voting for the increases in the minimum wage. This is really the first time that they decided they were able to block an increase, and then masses of people, the movement, the labor-led movement, decided, the hell with you, we're going to go out, we're going to get it raised anyway.
Hell no, we're going to do it anyway. And
Yeah.
that's what has to be done. If
Yeah.
we could take a site for at the end of the show off the domestic issue and talk about some things that are happening abroad. Sue, you mentioned to me before the broadcast started that the people of Okinawa are trying to get rid of the military base there, and this is the most underreported story of the week. I haven't heard anything about it. What's going on?
Well, the Okinawan people, you know, Okinawa is famous to Americans mainly from most Americans mainly from World War II. And the U.S. actually occupied Okinawa for a long time. It was under military occupation. And, you know, it's an island chain in the south of Japan. Anyway, the governor, there's been huge opposition. It's a huge concentration of U.S. military bases there. And now the U.S. is relocating a base that was very controversial in a very heavily populated area. But instead, they've decided to build a huge new base in an environmentally sensitive part of Okinawa. And there's massive opposition to it. The city re-elected a mayor who's spoken out against it and traveled to the U.S. to try to draw attention to the problem. Now the newly elected governor, who is strongly opposed to this base construction, came to the U.S. last week. He went to Hawaii, where there's a large Okinawan population, and then he came to Washington and met with officials. He did not meet with John Kerry or President Obama. You know, they had him meet with lower level officials, but the State Department issued a statement saying, no, we have to build this base. It's essential to U.S. whatever strategy and security. Completely ignored. There have been massive protests going on for a long time of all kinds. It's the Okinawan people are opposed to this. It's just disturbing, and it's been really not reported in the mainstream media at all.
Maybe this is part of this pivot to Asia.
Definitely. Definitely, but to ride roughshod over the wishes of the people there, it's really a problem, and it reveals something really not nice about U.S. foreign policy and this so-called pivot to Asia, which is geared largely against China.
Right.
It's not going to help the U.S. Standing abroad or its policies.
Right. Well, look for that story and more in the pages of the web pages of peoplesworld.org. We invite you to visit us at www.peoplesworld.org and check us out on Facebook, where you will find stories about Okinawa. And also, let me just mention before we end, Cuba was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for the work of doctors and nurses and other medical workers fighting Ebola in countries in West Africa, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, and so on. What a great thing they did there, and I hope that they win it. We're going to have to try to carry out a campaign to make sure that happens. Well, thanks, guys. We'll see you later on in the working day. To all of our viewers, we wish you a great week. And we'll meet you again next Monday at 8 a.m. Where we debate this week in the news. Take
8
care.
a.m.
Take
Eastern
care. Thank
Time.
you, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.